Content warning. This video contains descriptions of public humiliation, physical mutilation, and mob violence. Viewer discretion advised. Dramatization based on chronicles. Imagine being dragged into a stadium designed to hold 50,000 people. The air is thick with dust and the scent of sweat and horses. Banners ripple in a wind that tastes of salt and iron. You kneel on packed sand, so hot it seems to burn through the soles of your feet. Your hair has been cut close to the scalp. Your clothes have been torn to tatters and tied in a mockery around your waist. The great oval of the Hippodrome of Constantinople surrounds you, marble tiers climbing like a cliff, filigreed colonnades, an imperial box carved in gold and ivory high above the sand. There is no mercy in the faces above, only the hunger of a crowd expecting spectacle. From the far gate comes a low, measured thunder. The animal is guided into the arena, its breath steaming, its hooves ringing on the stone. 50,000 people lean forward as one. Your heart hammers against your ribs. You are a noblewoman, shorn, shamed, exposed, presented not to plead but to be displayed. This is not a battlefield execution. It is an engineered humiliation meant to rewrite what you are in the eyes of the city. If you want more hidden histories like this, like and subscribe. Pull back from that frozen frame. The scene you just imagined is not a fantasy invented for shock. It is a composite dramatization, an assembly of the kinds of accounts chroniclers recorded when the Hippodrome ceased to be merely a place of sport and became an arena for political theater. Historians warn us that the specific names and minute details of such scenes are often lost or colored by bias. Still, the pattern is clear across sources. The Hippodrome was built to enthrall, to convene, and, at times, to punish. At the heart of this story stands the Hippodrome itself, an instrument more than an amphitheater. Located in the ceremonial heart of Constantinople, adjacent to the imperial palace and the great churches, it was designed to stage chariot races, thunderous quadrigi driven by men whose courage and recklessness made them the city's true celebrities. Its capacity was vast. Ancient writers and modern estimations suggest tens of thousands could gather within its stone embrace. The arena's sand floor, scraped and raked for races, was also the perfect stage, a neutral, visible surface where bodies, animals, and symbols could be paraded under the sun. Structurally, the Hippodrome combined spectacle with control. Twins of long spina ran down the arena's center, ornamented with obelisks, statues, and turning posts. The imperial cathedra, the emperor's box, sat prominently, a throne from which rulership could be performed and observed. Beneath the tiers, historians and archaeological remains indicate there were holding rooms and corridors, spaces where prisoners could be prepared, strip-searched, and kept out of sight until the precise moment of humiliation. In other words, the architecture itself coded a politics of display. The emperor elevated above the sand, the crowd surrounding like a living wall, the condemned placed on the same plane as sport and ritual. This was theater that taught a lesson each time the gates opened. To understand how the Hippodrome evolved from entertainment to instrument, we must understand the city's factional life. The Greeks of Constantinople did not come to the races simply as passive spectators. They arrived as members of political households, blues and greens, initially color-coded allegiances tied to teams, drivers, and circus families. Over decades, the colors accreted meaning, identity, neighborhood loyalty, guild affiliation, and finally, political muscle. What began as cheer and rivalry hardened into networks that could, and did, protect interests, enforce local order, and, when the stakes rose, act as a private militia. The factions were not a mere fan club. They were social institutions embedded in daily life. They coordinated seasonal processions, paid for temple repairs, policed local markets, and intervened, often violently, when their pride or patron felt affronted. Chroniclers such as John Malalas and later writers depict blues and greens as vital cogs of urban governance, but they also warn of their volatility. Membership was performative and binding. Color did not only mark who you supported in a chariot race, it declared who you could trust in a lodge-lit street skirmish at midnight, who might come to your aid in a market dispute, or, conversely, who might chant for your ruin from marble tiers. This loyalty made the Hippodrome a political amphitheater. From the imperial podium, an emperor could turn what was entertainment into a performative demonstration of authority. Likewise, a crowd could turn sport into sedition. The factions amplified messages for and against rulers, and the sound they made, when unified, could become a roar powerful enough to unsettle the palace. Which is how we arrive at January of 532, a month that transformed the Hippodrome from a place of competition into a scene of political crisis. Contemporary chronicles record an eruption of anger known to history as the Nika riot. The triggers were complex: unpopular tax measures, political infighting at court, resentful elites, and judicial decisions that fed factional grievance. Long ago, the blues and greens had been on opposite sides. In 532, they found, momentarily, a common cause. According to Procopius, John Malalas, and other chroniclers, the factions fused their chants into one refrain, Nika, meaning conquer or victory. What began as an outcry over the conviction of popular charioteers swelled quickly into a riot that swept across the city. This loyalty made the Hippodrome a political amphitheater. From the imperial podium, an emperor could turn what was entertainment into a performative demonstration of authority. Likewise, a crowd could turn sport into sedition. The factions amplified messages for and against rulers, and the sound they made, when unified, could become a roar powerful enough to unsettle the palace. Which is how we arrive at January of 532, a month that transformed the Hippodrome from a place of competition into a scene of political crisis. Contemporary chronicles record an eruption of anger now known to history as the Nika riot. The triggers were complex: unpopular tax measures, political infighting at court, resentful elites, and judicial decisions that fed factional grievance. Long ago, the blues and greens had been on opposite sides. In 532, they found, momentarily, a common cause. According to Procopius, John Malalas, and other chroniclers, the factions fused their chants into one refrain, Nika, meaning conquer or victory. What began as an outcry over the conviction of popular charioteers swelled quickly into a riot that swept across the city. The first hours of a modern historian's account read like an audition of urban panic. The Hippodrome filled with bodies, the emperor and his entourage watching as disorder radiated into the streets, fires igniting in neighborhoods, and palace gates besieged. Chronicles offer different emphases and numbers. Procopius frames the uprising in terms of political peril for the imperial couple. John Malalas stresses mob fury and violence. Marcellinus Comes provides a terse register of destruction. Estimates of the death toll and damage vary. The ancient sources give large, dramatic figures, while modern historians use archaeological and administrative records to propose more measured ranges. Contemporary reports commonly cite figures in the tens of thousands, with many modern scholars tending toward lower, though still appalling numbers. These disagreements matter. They remind us that magnitude is sometimes a tool of rhetoric as well as a measure of tragedy. When the Hippodrome became the focal point of the rebellion, the place that had once echoed with the clash of chariots now thrummed with political energy. The crowd there was not merely watching, it was deciding policy with its voice, and in the Byzantine imagination, that voice could challenge the emperor himself. Justinian I, still early in his reign, faced a choice that would define his emperorship: negotiate and risk appearing weak, or act with force and risk tearing the city apart. The palace was filled with counsel. According to Procopius, some advisors urged flight, others urged conciliation.
Procopius's narrative, always to be read with caution because of his own political distances, attributes to Empress Theodora a hardening of will. He records that she preferred to remain, to stand her ground rather than flee and let the mob interpret the royal family's retreat as guilt. Later chroniclers amplify the theme of the empress's defiant resolve as a hinge of the story. Whether the precise words recorded by Procopius were actually spoken is unknowable. What matters is that Byzantium's chroniclers preserved, as a theme, the idea of the imperial presence as essential to authority. In this moment, the Hippodrome's role as a political stage reached maximum intensity. The crowd could, theoretically, demand an emperor's head. On the palace steps, Justinian weighed his options. Outside, the crowd's chants swelled. Inside the city, fires crept from block to block. Troops and palace guards were mustered. The emperor could not be seen retreating. Display, ritual, and the optics of command mattered as much as force itself. In the background of all of this stood Belisarius, the field general whose reputation would eventually be mythologized. According to Procopius, Belisarius was sent with a small, disciplined force to confront the rebels.
The exact composition of his detachment and the details of the ensuing street fighting are described differently by each chronicler, but the outline is consistent. A concentrated burst of force staged to minimize palace exposure while maximizing the dramatic break of mob unity. Pause for a moment to consider the psychological mechanics at work. Popular rage, even when focused, lacks the cohesion of a trained military unit. The Hippodrome's layout exacerbated that fact. A crowd packed shoulder to shoulder, perched on tiers, and tangled in its own momentum. Chanting becomes conviction. Conviction becomes action, and action, in a tightly packed human body, becomes contagion. The state understood these dynamics. It built spaces, like the Hippodrome, where the emotional temperature of the city could be measured, modulated, and, if necessary, broken. That brings us back to the question posed earlier. How did sports fans become political enforcers? The Blues and Greens did not begin as a partisan pressure group attempting regime change. But social loyalty, ritualized performance, and the centrality of the Hippodrome in urban life made them more than a pastime. The faction became like an artery in a living organism. When occluded, the pressure rose elsewhere. When punctured, the bleeding could be sudden and dramatic. In the immediate aftermath of the initial confrontations, the city teetered. The rioters, having been expelled from certain quarters, retreated and regrouped in others. Fires had been set, buildings burned. Aristocrats and merchants fled or barricaded. Chroniclers emphasize the spectacle of destruction. The theater turned literal theater of war. Yet even in the images of conflagration, something else appears. The calculated use of the crowd as an instrument not merely of violence, but of symbolic demotion. Public destruction can be performative. Ruin can be staged as pedagogy. The Hippodrome, in normal times, staged victory and ritual. During crisis, it staged humiliation and terror. It is here that the darker repertoire of Byzantine spectacle begins to emerge. Beyond the sword, beyond execution, the imperial center developed techniques aimed at annihilating social identity without always spilling blood. Mutilation, shaming processions, mock coronations, and animal terror were methods that erased status and converted human beings into lessons. To be blinded publicly was to be declared unfit for rule. To be paraded, shorn, and stripped was to have one's name and family history rewritten before a city. Chroniclers recount such punishments in tones that vary between horror and detached reportage. The sources themselves often use these narratives as moral molecules, warnings about power, loyalty, and the consequences of hubris. Take for a moment the recorded case of the blinding of a rival. Stories later attached to figures like Romanos IV Diogenes.
According to later chronicles, blinding was both a legal and an extra-legal instrument, a way to neutralize political rivals while keeping them alive to avoid the stigma of blood guilt, a middle way favored by some Byzantine courts. The act of removing sight was symbolically powerful. Vision in the medieval mind equaled capacity to rule. To remove sight in public was to end political life without the finality of death, an endurance of shame that could last a lifetime. Or consider mock coronations, another technique of degradation. A defeated claimant could be paraded on the imperial podium, given a crown of straw or painted diadem, and then humiliated before the same populace that might once have cheered him. The point was not only to defeat, but to invert. The ritual of coronation, which had sanctified rulership, was reversed to undo legitimacy. And then there were the processions designed specifically for women of standing, a less discussed but pervasive strand of Byzantine public punishment. Chroniclers record episodes in which noble women accused of impropriety, of political influence, or simply labeled as rivals were paraded through the Hippodrome or through the city with their hair shorn, their clothing stripped, their faces exposed to scorn. These were not private scandals kept within family walls. They were public rewritings of identity. The shorn head, the torn dress, the crowd's jeer, these were instruments that altered a woman's social capital permanently, turning lineage into shame and banishment rather than execution. Such spectacles carried a twin message. They illuminated the ruler's power to humiliate and demonstrated how social death could be more total, in some respects, than physical death. These practices also reveal the gendered logics of control in Byzantium. Men who were punished, if they were of a certain rank, might be blinded, castrated, or executed. Women, especially noble women, often faced rituals that destroyed honor and marriage markets: shaming, exile, forced monastic tonsure. The state thus wielded gendered punishments to recalibrate the social order without always creating martyrs. Humiliation operated as social surgery, cutting away credibility, rights, and prospects. All of this, the architecture, the factions, the theatrical punishments, reminds us that violence in Byzantium was not always blunt. It could be surgical, calibrated, and designed to last. It could terrorize without necessarily killing, and it could enlist the crowd in its own perpetration. As the Nika crisis unfolded, the palace turned its attention to containment. According to Procopius, after days of violence and the seeming impossibility of a peaceful settlement, an order was given. Troops were to retake public spaces. Soldiers were to move through the city with controlled, disciplined force. Procopius reports that Belisarius, with a small body of men renowned for their training, positioned themselves at the gate of the Hippodrome.
The chronicler's description is cinematic by intention. Soldiers arrayed in formation, the muffled tension of breath, the brewing storm of the crowd. Other sources corroborate the presence of palace-aligned troops tasked with breaking the mob's cohesion. This is where the calculated mechanics of state violence come into starkest relief. A crowd, however vast, is vulnerable to an organized counterforce if that force can act decisively. The emperor, if he could orchestrate it, could convert spectacle into suppression. Yet the decision to unleash soldiers against one's own city could not be taken lightly. It carried risks. The killing of citizens in public could delegitimize rule, spur further rebellion, and stain imperial memory. And yet, in the calculus of survival and authority, some rulers opted to risk the stain rather than risk exile. The story, already saturated with moral questions, leaves us at its most volatile moment. The troops stand at the threshold. The crowd thrums, a living mass that could either scatter or be transformed into a slaughterhouse. Inside the palace, choices have been made, counsel given, and unspoken bargains perhaps struck. Outside, the Hippodrome's gates, those same portals through which chariots had once thundered, creak and brace. The city holds its breath. It is at this precise juncture, when spectacle and state power are about to collide in full force, that we pause. The arc that begins with a shorn woman in sand and moves through architecture, factional loyalty, and legal spectacle curves toward an eruption whose consequences will reshape both rule and memory. What follows will be the story of how the state reclaimed a contested public arena, how the instruments of humiliation were turned into instruments of mass suppression, and how, in the aftermath, the city attempted to remember and to forget. Before we proceed further into the most violent hours and their immediate aftermath, it is important to note the limits of our sources. Procopius, John Malalas, and Marcellinus Cames each bring their own vantage points, political sympathies, rhetorical aims, and temporal distances. Their numbers and emphases differ. Archaeology can reveal ruin and layers of ash, but not the exact human faces behind those ruins. Modern historians must weave these threads carefully, qualifying claims and measuring rhetoric against material evidence. The tensions between spectacle and record are themselves part of the story. Who gets to narrate a city's trauma, and how do those narratives serve power? We stand now on that knife edge, soldiers poised, the crowd a potential instrument of both judgment and destruction, the imperial presence a symbol and a target. The next movement will show whether the Hippodrome remains a theater of games, a forum of political claim, or becomes, for a moment, a slaughterhouse, repackaged as justice. Content warning: the next sections describe mass killing and organized public humiliation.
Viewer discretion advised. Dramatization based on chronicles. Then the moment came. According to Procopius and the other chroniclers, the soldiers moved with a precision the mob could not match. Gates were barred, avenues were blocked. The disciplined line cut through the chaotic swell of bodies. The Hippodrome, moments ago a furnace of unified voice, became a sealed cage. Procopius gives us the cinematic detail that passed immediately into later memory. Trained men, measured, speaking little, their armor glinting, their formation closing like a vice. If these are literary flourishes, they nonetheless point to a real calculation. The palace did not simply crush a riot, it engineered the conditions under which the riot could be broken utterly. What followed is attested in sources that disagree about scale, but not about character. Contemporary chronicles report mass slaughter inside the Hippodrome and in the surrounding streets. Ancient figures, powerful in their rhetoric, place the toll in the tens of thousands. Some later summaries fix on a number near 30,000. Modern historians, weighing the rhetorical inclinations of 6th-century analysts and the demographic limits of the city, urge caution and propose lower figures, while still admitting catastrophic loss. Numbers are important, but so is the character of what happened. Disciplined force met an enormous urban crowd, and in so doing, converted a popular theater into a killing field. The violence was not merely reactive. It was performed to reassert the monopoly of order. Survivors wrote of bodies piling where chariots had once raced, and of the lingering smell of blood and smoke, images that persist in the textual record. Buildings adjacent to the Hippodrome were razed, fires consumed neighborhoods, a city's pulse lurched toward silence. The aftermath was not merely death or physical ruin. The message was clear. The visual language of the city had been rewritten. The emperor's authority, stained though it was by the decision to use force, was re-established by spectacle itself. The same instrument that had once enabled popular expression, the Hippodrome, now testified to what happened when that expression crossed an imperial red line. After the slaughter, the imperial response moved from bulk repression to selective humiliation. Chroniclers describe a process of naming, identifying prominent rebels, separating the elite from the anonymous dead, and subjecting them to punishments meant less to kill than to erase. Names and faces, social capital, were the currencies of Byzantine politics. Taking that currency away could be more effective and more legible than execution. We see this logic in a chain of practices that recur across the chronicles: public mutilation, ceremonial degradation, mockery of offices, and symbolic rites performed in front of crowds. Each punishment was a language of authority. You have been unmade.
To catalog these methods is to read a manual of statecraft from its cruelest margins. The accounts,
careful to note their provenance, show a repertoire that is horrifyingly systematic. Dramatization based on chronicles. Picture, as some sources do, a once powerful man led from a private house to the imperial stage. His garments, once embroidered in the patterns of command, are stripped. Eyes are bound. According to certain later chronicles, Romanos IV Diogenes, captured after defeat, was subjected to blinding. His fate is one of the most notorious examples of this practice. It is important to emphasize chronology and provenance here. Romanos's blinding occurred in the 11th century and is reported by later chroniclers such as Michael Psellos and John Skidlitz's. It serves as a vivid instance of a punishment that recurs in Byzantine history. The removal of sight had a double function. Practically, it removed a competitor without the stain of blood guilt. Symbolically, it marked the end of political vision, literally and rhetorically. Blindness made the man visible as a non-ruler. Blinding, however, was but one technique. Less executive and more performative was the procession of degradation. Noble persons, especially women, paraded shorn, shamed, and exposed. Chroniclers report that their hair, the core of social identity for men and women, was cut close. Garments were torn or replaced with rags, and names were called out for public scorn. The result was a type of social death. Stripped of honor, these people lost marriage prospects, political networks, and any prospect of meaningful reintegration. Sources we have name instances where the palace chose exile or forced monastic tonsure for former elites. Punishments intended not merely to remove individuals from power, but to recode social relations. Chariot dragging was another method the sources register as particularly theatrical. Unlike a swift execution by sword, this form of killing combined corporeal cruelty with public instruction. A condemned figure, bound to the harness, was drawn behind horses across the arena or along the city's streets. It was a spectacle of bodily dismemberment conducted in the sight of the populace. Punishment converted into visible, lingering exemplum. Chroniclers present these scenes with a measured horror, often to demonstrate moral lessons about hubris and the consequences of political challenge. Mock coronations and inversions of ritual deserve separate attention because they weaponized symbolism itself. A would-be usurper could be crowned with a false diadem, placed before the populace, and then publicly humiliated, sometimes through staged parodies of the rites that had once validated him. Those rites, sanctified ceremonies that established imperial legitimacy, were thus turned into instruments of derision. To be crowned in mockery was to have one's claim to authority dissolved in spectacle before the very people whose acclamations mattered.
Animal terror, perhaps the most dramatically staged of all, appears in assorted accounts and later tellings. These spectacles used living creatures as props of humiliation. The dramatized image we used at the opening, the shorn noblewoman confronted by an animal, is a composite reconstruction based on multiple accounts in which animals are used to intimidate, to shame, and, on rare occasions, to kill. Again, I must emphasize source caution. The exact details of any single episode are often reconstructed from fragmentary or partisan texts. Still, the motif recurs in ways that make it more than a mere trope. Animals, trained and presented, served the same dramaturgy of public instruction as crowns and scourges. Then there are the administrative rituals, the legal reclassifications that turned punishment into property. Confiscation of goods, the forced transfer of titles, the declaration of exile. These bureaucratic acts had the power to erase lineage. Byzantine governing procedures allowed the state to strip a person's civic identity without delivering physical death. For many, this meant a long afterlife of poverty, social invisibility, and the removal of descendants from networks of patronage. All these practices reveal an important logic. The empire prized continuity and order. Killing a member of the ruling elite risked creating a martyr, a rallying point.
Degradation destroyed political life without creating a symbol around which opposition could easily coalesce. Humiliation was surgical. It allowed the state to rewrite status hierarchies while keeping the physical body in play as evidence of state mercy or restraint. But why did crowds participate? Were they merely instruments or eager accomplices? The question leads us into the social psychology of the Hippodrome. Rhetorical, religious, and material elements converged to make participation not only possible, but, at times, likely. First, the architecture of the city and the arena facilitated contagion. The human mind evolved to respond to social cues. A chant in one tier becomes a pattern in the next. A cheer here becomes a cry there. In densely packed spaces, emotional arousal increases physiological arousal, heightening aggressiveness, decreasing individual inhibitory checks. The Hippodrome was, in effect, an emotional amplifier. That structural fact alone explains partial contagion. Second, the factions supplied identity. To belong to a color meant obedience to a set of norms and leaders. Once leaders signaled hostility, real or imagined, the rank and file followed. Factional leaders could mobilize men and women across neighborhoods. They could direct where rage was aimed. The factions' embeddedness in social life gave them the capacity to convert sporting passion into political action. Third, religious and ideological frames mattered.
Byzantine political theology made the emperor the image of God in public. Not that religion directly commanded mob violence, but the rhetoric of divine-sanctioned rulership gave the palace a vocabulary it used to justify actions and the populace a language for interpreting events. Sermons, icons, and public liturgies reinforced an image of order as a sacred good. When the empire invoked celestial sanction to defend its choices, that appeal resonated with many who feared anarchy above all. This is not a claim that Christianity endorsed atrocity. It is an observation about how a religious vocabulary was available to legitimize state decisions. Fourth, scarcity and spectacle. In an empire saturated with formalized rituals, public spectacles were scarce social currency. The Hippodrome delivered visceral, communal experience. For many, participation was not purely political but social, a chance to be seen, to be part of a crowd that mattered. That dynamic could make people seek out the intensity of communal action, even when it turned violent. Finally, fear and calculation played their roles. Some in the crowd chanted out of compulsion, fear of being outed as rival or traitor to the dominant faction. Others were active agents seeking vengeance, status, or material gain from the chaos. The psychology of crowds is not one-dimensional. It is a kaleidoscope in which altruism, violence, fear, and complicity coexist. Against this backdrop, gender operated as a distinctive vector of violence. The chronicles that record the humiliation of women, whether in narrow cases or in mass episodes, show that feminine honor was a political weapon in its own right. We must confront a particularly stark case that appears in the record: the fate of a group often counted as 73 noble women, a number present in some chronicled lists of punitive displays. Sources vary on exact detail. Some speak of mass parading before the people, others of selective exile or forced convent life. Whatever the precise events, the pattern is clear. Women's bodies and reputations were leveraged to make political points. In the aftermath of episodes like the Nika riot, male challengers might be killed, blinded, or exiled. Women, wives, sisters, daughters, were vulnerable to having their social value annulled. Haircut, clothing ripped, names called out, these acts functioned as public sentencing. The particular cruelty lies in the long shadow these punishments cast. Social death was inherited. A single public shaming could relegate a family to diminished marriage prospects, cut off alliances, and reduce the household's capacity to recover economically and politically. For rulers, this was efficient. The social networks of rivals could be dissolved by a single visible act. We should also address the role of powerful women such as Empress Theodora.
Chroniclers, particularly Procopius, who wrote with a mixture of admiration, bewilderment, and often scorn, credit Theodora with shrewd and at times ruthless political calculation. She appears in the sources as an advocate of standing firm in 532 rather than fleeing, an assertion that has been interpreted as pivotal. Yet her reputation is contested. Procopius's secret history paints her in sensational colors. Other sources offer more muted political analyses. What is clearer is that women at the center of government had leverage and occasionally used the Hippodrome as a stage to neutralize female rivals and to demonstrate the reach of imperial will. This brings us to an uncomfortable conclusion about the character of Byzantine power. Its bureaucratic refinement allowed cruelty to be theatricalized and sanitized. The same administrative apparatus that cataloged lands and collected taxes also kept lists of enemies and recorded decrees of humiliation. Law and ritual became instruments of social engineering. The effect was both immediate and durable. Those who were stripped of name and rank did not simply vanish from a ledger. They became a visible warning to anyone considering dissent. Having surveyed methods and motives, we can return to the specific trajectory of consequences. After the Nika riot's suppression, Justinian acted to reconstitute civic life. He moved, according to the record, to rebuild what was destroyed. The reconstruction of the city included monumental projects, perhaps most famously the rebuilding of the Hagia Sophia, which became a liturgical and imperial statement of continuity and divine favor. The message was twofold: order is restored, and the emperor's capacity to remake the city, and therefore the social order, remains absolute. Yet the reconstruction also functioned as selective memory-making. Rebuilding is a way of erasing traces. Streets are rerouted, neighborhoods razed and replaced with new monuments. The carnage of the riot risked being buried beneath marble. Chroniclers and imperial propaganda worked hand in glove to make this forgetting plausible. And yet, beneath the stones lay the human ledger of indentured lives, the blinded, the exiled, the shamed families. Here we should pause for a general cautionary note about sources. The main narratives of the Nika riot, the practices of public humiliation, and many of the episodes summarized above come to us through authors who are not neutral recorders. Procopius wrote in a courtly milieu and in private ferocity. John Malalas wrote with a mixing of civic pride and simplification. Marcellinus Comus kept succinct chronological registers. Later writers, sketching the blinding of Romanos IV, for example, often had their own agendas. Modern historians sift these accounts against archaeological data, administrative records, and comparative analysis. The result is not a monochrome truth, but an interpretive mosaic. We must therefore honor both the testimony and its limits. The chronicler's horror is a source for the events, but also for how the empire wanted or feared to be remembered. Turning from the past to present lessons, it is tempting to treat Byzantine spectacles as relics of a barbaric age, a moral wasteland far removed from modern sensibilities. But part of our duty as historians and citizens is to see patterns, not to moralize anachronistically. The mechanisms that enabled Byzantine spectacle, centralized power, rhetorical legitimation, architectural amplification of crowd emotion, the bureaucratic capacity to catalog enemies, are not unique to Byzantine. Empires and states across time have harnessed public display to normalize violence and to render terror legible as order. When governance sanitizes atrocity, it does so with familiar tools: public language that frames repression as necessity, ceremonies that reassign moral meaning, staged punishments that teach without making martyrs. The form changes, the logic persists. That is not an indictment of any single people, but a sober recognition that institutional power tends to generate instruments for its own preservation, some of which can be cruelly efficient. Remembering victims, then, becomes a political act of resistance against this sanitizing tendency. It requires us to name, to contextualize, and to feel the human cost beneath official narratives. If the empire sought to turn a massacre into a lesson about order, our response should be to recenter the human stories erased in official mosaics, even when, or especially when, those stories are fragmentary. Dramatization based on chronicles. Return for a moment to the composite image we opened with. Helena, shorn and humiliated, the city's roar a wall above her. Our dramatization did not invent that template. It synthesized patterns present across chronicles: shorn hair, public display, animal intimidation, and exile. What became of women like this in the recorded cases? Sources vary. Some are banished to distant islands. Others enter nunneries under compulsion. A few are simply removed from the political gallery and left to fade. The specificity of any single woman's fate is often lost. What survives is form, the spectacle of erasure. If we are to give Helena a conceivable arc consistent with the patterns we read, it is a bleak one. Stripped of social currency, her family loses standing. Her marriage prospects evaporate. Her children's futures are scarred by her public memory. We must stress again that Helena is a composite, a dramatized figure meant to make concrete the strategies chroniclers describe. She is not a documented individual, but an embodiment of many women recorded only in fragments. Finally, what is the ethical takeaway? We can propose 3 cautions that emerge from this history. First, civilization's apparatus can make atrocity efficient and palatable.
Marble palaces, legal codes, and liturgical rhetoric do not preclude cruelty. They can refine its execution. Second, public humiliation destroys identity in a way that physical death does not. To kill a body is to remove a life. To degrade a social person is to annihilate networks of meaning, and to do so for generations. Third, memory matters. Empires are adept at rewriting narratives. Remembering victims is an act that resists official amnesia. If this account leaves us unsettled, that is appropriate. The history of the Hippodrome and its conversion into a tool of coercion and spectacle forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human capacity to normalize violence. Yet confronting that past is not fatalism. It is a means of vigilance. By studying how spectacle, law, and architecture combined to produce terror, we can better recognize similar configurations in our own time. Content warning. The last passages include descriptions of humiliation and state-sanctioned cruelty. Viewer discretion advised. Dramatization based on chronicles. In the quiet that followed the riot, the city tried to stitch itself back together. Justinian and Theodora, both figures whose reputations will forever be entwined with this moment, reconstituted a narrative of divine favor and imperial necessity. Courts convened. Lists of property were drawn. The names of those who would be punished in visible, disciplinary ways were recorded. Some were blinded. Some were forced into monastic life. Others lost lands, honors, and, crucially, names. The streets, once echoing with the chorus of faction, fell to a cold order where the emperor's presence was both enforced and commemorated. This is how power preserves itself, not only by killing the massive bodies that threaten it, but by engineering a future in which humiliation serves as a lesson, where law, liturgy, and architecture converge to reaffirm hierarchies. The Hippodrome was central to that effort because it had always been central to the life of the city. Built to stage races and civic joy, it could, under the right pressures, stage a warning. We close where we began, with the image of a crowd and an individual, one representing many, placed in the center of a city's attention. Those dramatic moments, traced in chronicles and reassembled by historians, remind us of the brittle line between spectacle and terror. When an institution accustomed to performative authority turns its devices against its own subjects, the result is more than immediate harm. It is a cultural mutation that echoes down generations.
If this exploration resonated with you, please consider sharing it to help remember the people's names rarely survive the official record. For a fuller list of primary and secondary sources, consult the video description. Procopius, John Malalas, Marcellinus Combs, Theophanes, and later chroniclers such as Michael Psellos and John Skylitzis, along with modern scholarship cited there.
Reflect, read, and remember. Final content warning. The historical record contains further accounts of public humiliation and mutilation. If you feel affected, take a moment and consult resources in the description for more contextual reading and support. If you found this examination meaningful, subscribe for more deep dives into overlooked histories, and share this video to honor those erased from the margins of official narratives.